Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome to this mini unit on creation and evolution. We're going to be exploring both creation and evolution. We're going to compare the two. And I thought it might just be nice if just did a few short videos to explain both the concepts so that you guys have a resource that you can sort of have a look at. Okay, so why don't we get straight into it. Now, creation and evolution. In this particular video, we are going to focus on evolution. We're going to understand what evolution is, what drives evolution, and also some of the evidence that we have for evolution. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, understanding evolution. So in terms of definition, evolution is the change in heritable characteristics in an organism, in organisms over generations. Yeah, and so the key words here is heritable and over generations. Yeah, so heritable meaning it gets passed down, and generation gets passed down from one generation down to the next. Okay, it is in terms of easy way to understand. It's what we call descent with modification. Evolution is an outcome. So every time a generation changes to the next one, that's evolution occurring. Okay, it's not a mechanism and it's not the driving force for anything, but it is the result of some of those driving forces. And the last thing is that it's a scientific theory. You may see this picture, often around to represent that kind of evolution of man. The theory of evolution proposes that it is possible for organisms to make small alterations in the characteristics, and what we would expect is that over time these characteristics then continue to become more and more developed until you get an entirely new species. Now, as with all scientific theories, it is just an explanation of some aspect of the natural world according to what we call the scientific method of using a hypothesis, observation, and then coming up with an explanation that supports the evidence. Okay, that is supported by the evidence. Now, this is different from the common word, the common use of the word theory. It's not just some sort of guess or speculation, but we use evidence, and then we then try and come up with an explanation for the evidence that we observe. And so scientific theories are theories after all. They're never regarded as absolute truth, not even by the scientific community. They are simply the best explanation that we have at the time, okay, according to science. You may hear the term, if humans came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys around? And so it's worth maybe clarifying the idea of change over time to descent with modification. Now, evolution is descent with modification. It is not change over time. Okay. If you are a fan of Pokemon, you would know that the word evolution is used when one Pokemon changes into another one. That is not scientific evolution. Okay, that is a change over time. It does not. The organism doesn't miraculously change over its lifetime, but what happens is as it descends, as it passes on to the next generation of offspring, the traits are being passed on. So, change over time could be a tree dropping its leaves during the winter, whereas descent with modification, that is evolution, occurs when traits are being passed down to different generations. Okay, so that's worth clarifying. And so one of the key things that you'll notice is that with descent with modification, there is always a common ancestry between organisms, and that's what we often look for, is the common ancestor between those organisms. Here is a little phylogenetic tree of evolution of elephants, and you can sort of see the time frame down the bottom, and then what happens over time with generations and generations of elephant, each sharing common ancestry. So whenever it branches off, you say that the two parts of the branch share this common ancestor. That's there, one there as well, one there, and there. And you can sort of see the African elephant and the Asian elephant have different common ancestry. Asian elephants being closer related to the mammoth than they are to the African elephant. So obviously the mammoth is not around and it is extinct, but we still have these two extant species today. Okay. Now, human evolution. Let's take a look at the fossil record for humans. This is dated in 2007, so it's not the most up-to-date one, but it is a pretty good one. So the first earliest known human sort of arrived about 7 million years ago. And to give a bit of a frame of reference, there's us, the modern man, or the Homo sapien, up here. Now, there's a few things to note about this phylogenetic tree, or this family tree. We use the fossil record to identify all kind of lineages from the past. And so it's not perfect. We're not going to get an absolutely clear lineage. So you can sort of see a few gaps here and there around where the bridging organisms are, and you know, which humans were there first, etc., etc. But the idea that humans have evolved over time from apes sort of are represented here. The first human-like ape would have been around 7 million years ago, and then by the way, that's the Neanderthals. You may, some of you guys are familiar with that, some of you guys aren't. And then you can sort of see the first actual sort of human sort of occurred around about this break here from Australopithecus, and transforming, or not transforming, sorry, you know, descending into the genus Homo, which is where all humans fit under. Homo habilis, meaning handyman, the first sort of recognizable fossil of a person using tools, comes from Homo habilis. And then you've also got, as it branches its way through, somehow reaching towards Homo erectus, handyman, and then it branches through until we get to the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals around there. Okay. Now, one of the things to note here is that this fossil record is not perfect. Okay, and so there are gaps here and there to show the descent and linking common ancestry between different groups of the genus Homo and the genus Australopithecus. Yeah, and so it's really useful to know and to understand, when it comes to human evolution, what the fossil record shows of us humans. Okay. Now, evolution really explains to us why we have the diversity of life that we have today. Yeah, and why different species have sort of arisen over the past. Yeah, the theory of evolution implies that, you know, at some point all of life had descended from one common ancestry, that is a single cell organism somewhere back then, which then branches off into the various species that we see today. Yeah, and that's the theory of evolution. Okay. Now, how does it occur? Once again, evolution is an outcome. It's a result and a change. Okay. Not all Christians debate that organisms can change over generations, but we are more interested in knowing what causes them to change. And it is these that really get us to question and sort of think thoroughly about how we understand evolution. And so we call them mechanisms. These are the driving force that results in the change that we see. Okay, and we're going to have a look at 3 of them, but we're only going to focus on the first one really, which is natural selection. It's the main focus for this unit. There's also gene flow and genetic drift or mutation as well. Okay. Now, before we sort of go into that, we have to understand the role that mutation plays in evolution. Yeah, because it's the key aspect. Mutation is when the genetics or the DNA of an organism permanently is altered, and then you know, within its genome. Yeah. Now, these small changes can accumulate, and then it gets passed on to the offspring. And when it gets passed on to the offspring, over a long period of time, you would expect these changes to become bigger and bigger, and you get evolution occurring. Now, a species evolves because of the accumulation of mutations that occur over the generations. So you might start with this original DNA with that particular strand, and then somehow the copying or the photocopying process makes a mistake and creates this mutant copy that is slightly different from what we would normally expect, and that change gets passed on to the offspring. If that change occurs in a regular cell, which we call a somatic cell, then it doesn't change and it doesn't get passed on, and it just stays with that particular organism. However, if it occurs in a germline cell or an egg or a sperm, then that does get passed on, and so all of its subsequent offspring then carry that mutation, and that is sexual reproduction. Yeah, it passes on those mutations to the next generation. Okay. Now, to understand to understand evolution, we have to look at kind of the persons that sort of made it famous. Now, Charles Darwin was born in 1809 to 1882. He was a naturalist, a geologist, and a biologist. And he was the one who coined the term natural selection in his 1859 book, The Origin of the Species. He presented his theory of evolution. Now, he did not come up with evolution per se, but he was one of the main driving force to really validate it and explain it as a possible theory that organisms can change over time, and at some point or another, all species had descended from a common ancestor. Okay, so here's a picture of Darwin. There's a picture of him around about the time frame when he published his book, and there's his book there. Okay, So, really famous guy, pivotal role in understanding evolution and therefore kind of all of biology, really. Now, in 1831, he actually set off to South America, and he was studying the local flora and fauna there. He's collecting samples and making observations. He ended up on these set of islands called the Galapagos Islands, and he was studying a type of bird, which were a type of blackbird or a mockingbird, which we all know today as Darwin's finches. Now, he wasn't really studying finches because they didn't really belong to the finch family, but we commonly call them finches. Okay, so there's the Galapagos Islands. It's a really beautiful place. And on the islands lived all these finches, and what he noticed that different islands contain these kind of different finches, and different areas on the main island also contained different varieties of finches, and they all were very similar in terms of their structure, but slight differences between their beak size and their body size and things like that. And Darwin found out that the beak size were matching in terms of their ecology, what they ate, and how they use their beaks changed or largely determined the beak size and the beak form. Yeah? And so you've got these kind of insect or seed eaters, insect eaters over here, seed eaters, fruit eaters, and each one having a slightly different form. And so he sort of made these observations and realized that actually these changes must have sort of come from a common ancestor of the finch, and these slight and small changes that he observed was a particular, common ancestor branching off into the wide variety of finches that he saw today, and he proposed this theory that at some point they all shared a common ancestor, and they evolved their particular adaptations for the purpose of their diet and what they were known to eat. And so that was the kind of where he published his theory of evolution from. Okay. Now let's look at natural selection, which is what he sort of coined and he used to explain evolution. Now, natural selection is not the only explanation for evolution or the driving force, but it is one of the main ones that we understand, and it was made really popular by Darwin. Let's go with a bit of an example. Let's say you've got two different species of frogs, grey tree frogs and green tree frogs. Both of them, with the exception of their color, are pretty much identical. Okay, they both eat insects, they live off the ground, they lay eggs in pools of water, and they are hunted by birds and snakes. Now the question we have is, well, if they're so similar, why is it that we have two different species and not just the one species? Okay, but the answer sort of becomes a little bit more clear and easy to understand when we look at their habitat range and where you actually find these particular frogs. The grey tree frog is found all over America, and particularly in the northern areas, whereas the green tree frog is usually only found in the southern states. And if you look specifically at their habitats, grey tree frogs are known to occupy woody plants and places where there's a lot of lichen, and so you can see there that they blend in with the environment really well. Green tree frogs, however, sort of sit on the stalks of leaves that are green, and so they also fit in with the environment particularly well. Okay, and so if you take one as an example, let's take the green tree frog as an example. Evolution by natural selection sort of says if you've got a population of, let's say, a primitive tree frog, the common ancestor of all those frogs, and there is a bit of diversity, there's small changes or differences between their genes of each species or each individual, which causes this genetic diversity of this primitive tree frog species. Now, let's in this particular case say that they occupy the wetland habitat, which is this sort of area here where there are lots and lots of water and these kind of green stalks coming out of that. Okay, now the frogs will experience some sort of selection pressure. Now, selection pressure is anything that causes a trait to become favored. In this particular case, let's say it's predation. They're being hunted by birds. Now, the birds are going to be able to pick off the frogs that they can see because they hunt by sight. And so of the different colors that the frogs may have, some colors are better at fitting in with the environment than others. So in particular, green tree, the green color of this primitive tree frog might actually be helping it survive better. And so because it does that, the individuals will survive the selection pressure. And let's say the bird is unable to really see the green tree frogs. It might be able to catch one or two, but most of the green tree frogs will survive, whereas the other colors will not, because they're too obvious and they're too easy to be picked out by predators. Now, those tree frogs, the surviving ones, the green ones, will then pass those traits on to their offspring through reproduction. And by passing on those tree frogs, the next generation will result in a change. That is, it will change to become green. Yeah, and so that's one generation of kind of change that you will observe and we can see happening, and it is all driven by this selection. There is this favoring of a particular trait in the environment, and in this particular case it is a green color. Yeah, and so green tree frogs would have evolved this green color on their skin to adapt to the wetland habitat. Yeah, and so that is natural selection favoring the green tree frog color. Okay, and so this is what Darwin calls survival of the fittest. Now, survival of the fittest is a kind of common word that we now understand and use quite sometimes out of context. Fitness, or the ability to fit into their environment, is what we often mistake. Yeah, and so that's in this particular case a green tree frog. Now, if we were to take a reverse kind of habitat, and let's say we took them into woodlands where there's a lot of grey and a lot of kind of moldy green colors, you would see that maybe the reverse might happen, that natural selection would favor not the green tree color, but the grey or the moldy green color. And so selection advantages would then be reversed. Okay, now that is natural selection. So when we define natural selection, it is a process by which organisms can better adapt to their environment, and they can reproduce and pass those traits on to their offspring. Okay. Other examples you can sort of see in terms of traits. Orchids. A lot of orchids will look like wasps, and what they actually do there is that by natural selection would favor the orchids that look like wasps, because the ones that look like wasps get mated by male wasps and now pollinate more successfully. And so that ability to fool wasp into thinking that you're a female wasp helps it survive. And so it can pass its DNA onto its offspring, and they will survive looking more and more like wasps. Camouflage. A lot of camouflage also can occur through natural selection. Katydids, this little fella here, the body of the katydid looks remarkably like a leaf. And so we can explain that by saying natural selection has favored the bodies of katydids that are green and look more like leaves, because they are less likely to be hunted, and then those genes are being passed on. Natural selection can also explain mimicry, why some organisms will look like some other organisms. The one on the right here is the coral snake. The coral snake is a highly venomous snake, and a toxic snake that predators tend to avoid. However, the scarlet king snake looks very remarkably like the coral snake. It doesn't look exactly the same, but it looks similar, even though it's non-venomous, because by looking similar, predators tend to avoid this particular species, and now its offspring end up looking very similar to the real thing. Okay, behaviors can also be shaped by natural selection. For example, instinct. Pack instincts in animals can be shaped by natural selection, favoring living in groups rather than living individually. It also can determine why spiders sort of develop this kind of web feature there, and they instinctively know how to form a web because that particular behavior is favored by natural selection. This is a nest from the blue bowerbird, and the blue bowerbird is actually a bird species that the males are blue and they form this kind of nest, and they actually collect blue things to attract females. And so natural selection actually favors the blue color because females are more attracted to it, and so males end up collecting more and more, and that behavior, that instinctive behavior to look for blue things, gets passed on to the next generation. Okay, so that just helps us understand one of the driving forces and the main driving force as to why organisms will change over time, because their environment favors it, and to survive they need to be able to adapt and pass those traits on. Okay, here is a case study. Now this is probably the most directly observable evidence for natural selection, and because in peppered moths. Now peppered moths occupied much of England, and they are light-colored, which are really good effective camouflage on tree trunks. And so they look like these kind of white moths with this kind of peppered coat, and then they adapt and they camouflage really well to the tree trunks. Now, interestingly enough, prior to 1848, Majority of the moths that they found were the peppered moths. But then in 1848, there's this appearance of this kind of dark-colored moth, which they called the melanic form of this peppered moth, appearing in Manchester, which was at that time an industrial city. And so the question is, why did this black form of the peppered moth suddenly appear in 1848? And so if you look at the evidence, the black peppered moth, in terms of its features, it's not very camouflaged on the trunks of these trees. If you look here, clearly the white peppered moth adapts much better to those trees. So why is it that this black melanic form has suddenly appeared? Well, it turns out that during the Industrial Revolution, the factories produced a lot of soot, and then the soot covered the trees and it made them darker. And so during that time, the trees became darker. And so now we can see the tables have turned. You've got two moths, the white one being really obvious and easy to spot and hunted down by predators, the black one actually being more camouflaged. And so the samples that were collected in Manchester showed a drastic rise in the population of black-bodied moths, because that was an industrial city where the soot was covering the trees. And you can see the change in population there, that dark peppered moths were on the rise, whereas the light one actually declined because of the change in the environment. And so natural selection switching halfway and favoring the black peppered moths. And you can see, in the first generation, you might have only a few, but as the generations progress, you get more and more because they adapt better, are more likely to survive, and therefore pass those DNA on to their offspring and the traits. Okay, and then what we noticed is that about the mid-1900s, factories started to improve in terms of their output, and less soot was being emitted. The trees were no longer dark, and then the air quality is improved, and so there's actually a reverse now. So you can see once again the blue here represents the white-bodied pepper moths population rising again, and the dark-bodied pepper moths were actually dropped, and so the reverse now begins to occur. And so the smoke pollution level decreased around about up to the 1980s, and as a result the melanic form, or the dark peppered moth, actually dropped as well. Okay. Now the next mechanism which we're going to look at is called gene flow. We're not going to focus too much on the next two, but it's worth just mentioning other mechanisms. Evolution by gene flow. Gene flow is when you get the genes from one population transferring to another population through migration. Migration being the key word here. Yeah. Now, what gene flow does is it introduces new genes into a population, and it increases the diversity of the population. It's a good source of variation, and it drives diversity, and that diversity is what results in evolution. So if we look at an example here, you might have two populations of deer separated by this geographical barrier, a mountain range. Let's say a few individuals of the deer manage to cross that mountain pass and into those different populations. What happens is they will carry with them a different set of genes. In this particular case, the genes for a lighter bodied coat. Okay, and so that will be injected into this gene pool of population of deer here and increase their variation. When you increase variation, you drive evolution because it results in a change in the species. Okay, now you can take this and you can use the same thing for all sorts of other genes, including immunity and all those other things as well. Okay, so that's just gene flow. And the last one is genetic drift. Evolution by genetic drift. Genetic drift is really just chance. Yeah, you get a change in genes frequency or allele frequency due to chance. Yeah, especially when there's nothing to drive or select for a particular trait. Nothing, that particularly chooses a trait for an organism to survive better. Evolution can naturally occur through genetic drift. Okay, it's entirely by chance, and the longer that it's left alone, the further it drifts away until the allele becomes fixed. And when it becomes fixed, it either disappears or it is then selected for. There's something in the environment that favors that particular gene, and it gets passed on to its offspring. Okay. If you look at a population, you might have a population of green beetles and a population of brown beetles. And by chance, someone had walked over and stepped on two of the green beetles. And so now you've only got one green beetle left and 6 brown beetles. And so what's going to happen is that green beetle, that green the gene for the green color of the beetle is going to slowly phase away because there's only one individual left. It can't reproduce, all those kind of things. Whereas the brown one's going to dominate, and this is entirely by chance. Nothing is driving the force for change other than the fact that someone accidentally stepped on the remaining beetles and can't reproduce anymore. Okay. Same thing can be done with marbles. If you take 3 different colored marbles, blue, yellow, and red, and let's say you tip them out into this kind of bottleneck, and you only get blue and yellow, yeah. And so by chance, purely by chance, only blue and yellow have appeared, and then the next generation is only going to be blue and yellow, right? You can take this analogy and you can apply to animals. If on the mainland you have 3 different species of birds, blue, yellow, and red, and then 2 of those species manage to fly over to an uninhabited island and settle at that particular island, and then reproduce and so populate the island, and you now have a change in the population, yeah. And so that's genetic drift at work. Okay. Okay, we are going to take a look at some of the evidence for evolution, and what is it that really supports evolution, and what can we observe and see about our world that can be explained by evolution. Okay, there are a few that we're going to look at. We're going to start with looking at fossils. Yeah, fossils give us a really good snapshot of organisms that have lived in the past, and one of the things that we have clearly noted is that organisms in the past are not the same as those living today, and so you have to question, why is it that they look differently in the past? And so evolution explains that by saying that these were lineages that are no longer around because species have evolved and they've changed over time. Okay, now if they have not overchanged, would we not then see fossils of animals that we observe today millions and millions of years ago? Fossils of elephants and fossils of tigers and lions, but those fossils just don't date back that long, right? And so we have to sort of say and conclude that what used to be around is no longer around today, and organisms have changed over time, over long periods of generations. Okay. Now there's a lot of things that we also notice is that there is a gradual change in fossil layers, and there's a lot of kind of in-between organisms between one particular notable species and another notable species. Okay. So if you look at the base layer of one particular fossil area, sometimes we will see at the very bottom the oldest fossils were that of these particular mammals here, or this mammal-like organism, and then you can see this gradual change in the fossil layers that look more and more like oceanic creatures, yeah. And so you get this kind of fossil and fossil, and then you get the kind of the modern whale which we now observe. And so there's this gradual change in the fossils, which represents some sort of change in the species over a period of time. Now, this is not to say that this organism changed into this one, which changed into this one, which changed into this one. We're just saying that they share common ancestors with the subsequent species. Okay, and then every time it kind of branches off into a different group. We also see evidence of transitional organisms. A species of fish that have remarkable fins and the accompanying bones that look really similar to land animals and a particular tetrapod, which is a 4-legged creature. Yeah, and so we can sort of see that this particular organism was somewhere sitting in between a fish and a land animal. Yeah, and so these transitional organisms are what we look for when we look for kind of missing links in the fossil record. Okay, transitional organisms. If we propose that all organisms come from a single origin, then that life would have originated in the oceans and then transitioned onto land. Now, if that was the case, you would look for animals that have some sort of link between fins and legs, because that's what evolution would suggest, that there is some organism out there that is transitioning between legs and fins, and we have found that organism, and it's called the titanic. There also has to have another organism that has a link between gills and lungs, which we found also, which is called the lungfish. And so the evidence shows, that in the past we found fossil evidence dating back over time of different forms of an organism which have very similar structures, gradually changing from your kind of oceanic or your river or sea organism gradually changing their form and structure over the generations into a land animal. So that transition movement there suggests that the organism has evolved and the species has changed over time. The titanic is that missing link. It is a fish that looks remarkably like an amphibian. Yeah, and so in terms of its structures, it's got the bones for legs, and it also has the kind of structural features of a terrestrial animal, but it also maintains a lot of its kind of fish-like structure. And so we've actually found that, and a fossil of that creature, and the bones are clearly marked there for us to see. And so that's the kind of the missing link or the transitional organism between land and sea. We've also found the remaining extant species, which is called the coelacanth. Now, the coelacanth is the kind of last remaining link between the lung, the fish that were ray-finned and the fish that were lobe-finned. Yeah, and so that you can sort of see this is also a transition species, and we haven't found it in the past, and that's what they were looking for, and then they found it, and it's still alive today, which suggests that it's an extant species, and it links between those organisms. Okay, the lungfish, you can sort of see the lungfish is alive and kicking today, but it suggests really well a kind of link between marine and or aquatic versus terrestrial. And the lungfish has gills like a fish, but it also has a small air sac which is like a lung. And so the air sac actually has a blood supply connected to it, which then allows the fish to oxygenate its blood through the lungs. And so it just breathes gulps of air and collects oxygen into that kind of makeshift lung. And so that's your kind of missing link that we look for, and that's clear evidence of an organism that is between two different organisms that we observe today, suggesting that there was some sort of gradual change over time. Okay. Other evidences: homologous structures, traits that are the same in form and derived from a common ancestor. Yeah. There might be small changes in shape and size, but largely we note that in terms of the anatomy of different animals, they look slightly different in terms of their size and shape, but the overall layout is actually the same. Okay, so if you look at the forearm of humans, horses, cats, bats, birds, and whales, you can see this generalized structure. Yeah, that you've got a large bone here connected by two bones, a set of other bones called the carpals, and then you've got your digits. Now, for each animal, the form and it looks slightly different, but the overall structure is pretty much the same. Yeah, you've got your bone, you've got your two bones, you've got the carpals, and then you've got, in the horse, fused digits. Okay, in the cats, very similar to the human, with a few notable kind of exceptions and claws and nails. Even in bats, we sort of note the same generalized structures, as well as in birds, the same generalized structures. Now, you would kind of think that if a bird was trying to develop a structure to fly, this particular structure having one long bone, two kind of in between bones, and a bunch of fused digits is not the best structure for flight. It is simply because these organisms have a common ancestry with other terrestrial ones, and therefore this is kind of a remnant of evolution. Yeah. Same with whales. You'd think flippers would look a little bit differently in terms of their bone structure, but they have the same kind of bone structure and layout as many of the other terrestrial organisms. Yeah, and so those features help us to understand that there must have been some sort of commonality between each of these organisms that give rise to those structural layouts. Okay, some organisms have organs and structures that serve absolutely no function at all. So it's a residual organ. It's a remnant of evolution. So whales have a kind of a remnant hip bone, or a kind of a hind leg, and it's really small and it's not noticeable in the whale, but the bone's still there. It's detached from the main spine and it serves no function, which suggests that it's really just a remnant of evolution. Snakes also have a remnant femur, which suggests that they had hind legs, but they slowly lost it over time in favor of just your kind of snake shape, which is just a muscular body. If you look at humans, we also have a remnant tailbone or coccyx, which serves absolutely no particular function, but is really a remnant of a tail that that they propose we used to have for monkeys, and no longer have, because it's kind of withdrawn and made redundant and useless. Okay, so those homologous structures suggest that there was some sort of link in the past. Okay, biogeography. Biogeography studies the distribution of species over the Earth. Okay, and one of the clear evidence for evolution is actually the geography of marsupials. Okay, so a lot of speciation is linked to the environment. When a species develops, it's usually developed because the environment favors that particular species, and it rises because of that. Yeah, and so these gradual change can then be observed. If we look at marsupials, interestingly enough, marsupials occur mainly in two particular continents: in Australia, where we've got the most species, and in South America. Okay, now the evidence for marsupials suggests, if we look at fossil records, that at some point marsupials did occur off in the mainland, but for some reason they've broken off and sort of stuck to just Australia and South America. But you can actually see, and if you follow the record, that there were descendants of marsupial fossils that sort of moved around the outside of Pangaea, which is what the continents used to be before continental drift split all the continents apart, through the coast of South America and through Antarctica, and then into Australia. And round about the time that Australia began to break off from Antarctica was when the marsupials migrated into Australia, and they were basically stuck there. They couldn't leave Australia because Australia had now become its own continent, and so the marsupials now inhabit Australia and were the dominant species there. Okay, elsewhere, all around the world, around about the same time when it sort of broke off, when Antarctica and Australia broke off from all the other continents, the rise of placental mammals, which are your kind of your horses, your dogs, cats, and all those things, have outcompeted the marsupials, and they became extinct on every other continent except for the ones that have broken off early. So South America and Australia being the ones that have broken off earlier than the rest of the continents. And so that indicates to us that at some point there was some sort of link in evolution which connected the species together. Okay. The last one is direct observation. We can actually observe some form of evolution occurring. It's easier to observe microevolution than it is to observe macroevolution. Okay, microevolution are those small changes over shorter time frames. Okay, that is in one generation, two generations, these small changes you can see. Macroevolution is a whole species change over a period of time. And the best example is actually, we noted the use of DDT. Now, DDT used to be an insecticide, and it was used to sprinkle on crops and things like that, and to manage pests in agriculture and things like that. So they sprayed DDT over a population of mosquitoes, and then one of the things they noted, this was probably back in a couple of decades ago, and one of the things they noted that in the first year, yeah, it killed maybe about 99% of the species, but then the next year, when they sprayed the same DDT over them, the population, only about 60 or 50% of the population actually died, and so the other 50% had actually changed to adapt to the DDT. And then once again, within the next 6 months, it only killed 20% of the population, which means more and more of the mosquitoes were adapting and changing with the generation to the DDT and becoming immune to DDT. Yeah. Now this is over kind of 2 generations, and it's a bit easier to observe some of these features than it is to observe large changes in things like whales and dolphins and things like that, because those changes, the life cycle of those animals are longer, and they take a lot longer time to exhibit and show. And so by then, usually we then look to fossil records and things like that to try and observe evolution. And so those things kind of together tell us, paint us a really good picture. This is what we observed, and evolution presents a theory that explains for the fossil record, it explains for the different homologous structures, it explains for the biogeography of marsupials and other organisms, and it also explains why different generations can adapt to things like DDT, mosquitoes, and so forth. Okay, so that's all the evidence for evolution. Okay, that's it. Hopefully you guys were able to gain a really good understanding of evolution and how it works. And next lesson we're going to take a look at creation and what are some of the things we can understand from creation, and then we'll compare the two. Okay, thanks guys, see ya.